I was talking to someone in the lunch line. They asked about the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge situation. And I did say that of any place in the West, as a federal employee, this is the place to be because there's such widespread support of our federal lands in this part of the country. So it is a real privilege to work here. Well, I want to thank you, Jonathan, for the opportunity to speak with you today. It's a real privilege to share some ideas in a setting that looks to the future. Because in one respect, the National Elk Refuge manages elk the same way it did 100 years ago. And the world has changed. So in order to look to the future, to ensure the health of the refuge, health of the elk herd, it's really imperative that we look into the future and give that some thought. So just following Jonathan's outline, what's crucial to know about the National Elk Refuge? First, a bit of background for context. Most people think the National Elk Refuge was established for an elk feeding program, and that is incorrect. In 1912, an act of Congress created the refuge for the establishment of a winter game elk reserve. In 1927, Congress expanded that purpose to include for the grazing of and as a refuge for American elk and other big game. There's never any mention of an elk feeding program. Congress also expanded the purpose of the refuge to include migratory birds, endangered species, some kinds of wildlife-dependent recreation. But the National Elk Refuge is just one refuge in a system of over 560 national wildlife refuges around the country, and the mission of that system can be summarized as wildlife first. There's no doubt that Congress was motivated to establish the National Elk Refuge after the extremely brutal winters of 1909 to 1911, when thousands of elk died of starvation. At that time, elk had been removed from most of its original range, and Jackson Hole was one of the last strongholds of elk, and this die-off really captured the attention of the country. Ranchers at that time started feeding elk as a way to, stop the mass starvation, and that approach was adopted by the National Elk Refuge and has become a tradition which we still follow today. In fact, there have been only 9 winters in the history of the refuge where elk have not been fed. So even though the refuge was not established for an elk feeding program, it's easy to understand why many people believe that is the purpose of the refuge. Our management is directed by the Bison and Elk Management Plan. That's a joint plan between the refuge and Grand Teton National Park. It's a 15-year plan that was completed in 2007. The overarching goal of that plan is to reduce reliance on supplemental feeding. Specific population goals include 5,000 elk on the refuge, on supplemental feed, and a total bison herd of 500 animals. And we've made some progress reducing the bison herd from 1,200 initially to about 700 today. However, the number of elk coming to the refuge feed program is increasing. Last year we had 8,400 elk on the refuge. So we really are going in the wrong direction for the goal that we have set for the number of elk on the refuge. What's the biggest single challenge facing the refuge? Well, it is to develop and implement a 21st century elk management strategy that reduces the potential for devastating disease outbreaks and ensures the long-term health of elk that winter on the refuge. Many in the public embrace the livestock approach of feeding elk. Many do not. It certainly is an effective approach if you want to maintain a population higher than the habitat can support. But times have changed in the last 103 years. Today, inherent with the approach of supplemental feeding is the risk of concentrating animals, creating conditions that open the door to devastating disease outbreaks, which can threaten the very elk that the feeding program is meant to benefit. When you concentrate animals in one place, the risk of disease transmission goes up exponentially. It's an easy concept to understand. You all have probably flown in a commercial airliner during the flu season, hoping you don't catch what the guy behind you is coughing. So that's what we're facing. Elevated disease prevalence on the National Elk Refuge is not a theory, it is occurring. For example, the brucellosis seroprevalence in elk on the refuge is about 35% of the herd. In unfed, unconcentrated elk populations, that seroprevalence is in the single digits. So there's a big difference, a big contrast. A disease on the horizon, CWD or chronic wasting disease, which is often referred to as the mad cow disease of deer, elk, and moose, is always fatal, and it marches ever closer to the National Elk Refuge. We likely cannot stop the arrival of CWD to the refuge, but do we really want to concentrate it and amplify it on the refuge? Because once an elk has CWD, they shed infectious proteins, prions, through their urine, feces, saliva. And that'll occur for as long as the animal lives, which is normally 18 months or longer. And so continuing to concentrate animals on the refuge that have this disease will concentrate these infectious prions on the refuge. And it appears that these prions can contaminate the landscape pastures for potentially decades, staying infectious in the soil and the plants. So the last thing that we want is to have the National Elk Refuge, instead of a place where elk come to survive our harsh Wyoming winters, they come to contract chronic wasting disease and basically receive a death sentence. So number 3, what is the single biggest opportunity that we have? I think the biggest opportunity is that we hopefully still have some time before there's a major disease outbreak, and that we can make changes to help prevent or at least mitigate the impact of these potentially devastating diseases. What is one thing the community can do to help you address the biggest challenge or opportunity? Well, our biggest opportunity and challenge is inexorably linked. Developing a 21st century elk management strategy before a disease hits is an effort to prevent or at least reduce the impact of these diseases. And I understand the whole concept of prevention is often a hard sell. It seems like our human nature, makes us delay action until we have a problem. So the subject of supplemental feeding is very complex. What can the community do? Well, as we explore new ways to manage the refuge, the community can become better informed of all of the ramifications of supplemental feeding. This is a controversial subject, and there's a lot of passion for and against feeding. But the community can help encourage an atmosphere of fostering openness and inclusiveness during this conversation. So, to promote and engage in meaningful conversation, we need to encourage that, not stifle robust conversation. We may not all agree about chronic wasting disease or other diseases and the threats that they pose to the future of the refuge and the elk that it serves, but we should be able to have a civil and meaningful discussion about the future of the National Elk Refuge and the long-term health of the elk herd, while understanding and respecting everyone's point of view. I'd like to just tear off of a comment that Mayor Flittner mentioned. She said it was easy to be divisive and critical. It was hard to sit down and problem solve with someone you don't agree with and someone you may not even like. So with that in mind, I'd like to just close and leave you with a quote from Olis Murray, very well known, the first elk refuge the first elk biologist in the valley, a national conservation leader. He said, I quote, "Wildlife management is a human problem. People enjoy wildlife in many different ways. When we reach the point where we can discuss plans honestly, realize the other fellow's interests and needs, and try to reach a mutual agreement on a goodwill basis, then we have taken the first essential step in wildlife management." Thank you.